Well, welcome to Life Groups. I'm excited for what God is going to be doing through this theme. Love everyone always. Wow, the year 2020, what a year. And I don't know if you're like me, but I'm just wondering, when's it going to be over? When is 2021 going to come? What is God doing and teaching us in this time? Global pandemic, political, cultural unrest, economic crisis, and yes, it is an election year. When is it going to be over? What are we learning through this? God, help us in this time of need. Well, this weekend we looked at the story of Joseph, in which he was sold by his brothers. He was put into a pit, and in that pit, then from there, he was sold to slavery to Egypt. You might ask the question, why? Why did that take place? And Joseph could have allowed his past to dictate his future. He could have allowed that situation with his brothers to bring about bitterness and revenge. But instead of bitterness and revenge, we're going to see that God used Joseph for a time like this. That Joseph was not going to be bitter, but he was going to be forgiving. That Joseph was not going to be a person of revenge, but he was going to be a person of release. This was not a situation or a disappointment of destruction, but this was going to be an appointment of God's deliverance for the people of Israel. And so things in our past, whatever they might be, relational disappointments, issues that we to this day find it hard to forgive, those disappointments, those situations, we cannot allow them to define us, but God uses our past to refine us. I'll say that again. Never allow your past to define you, but allow God to use your past to refine you, to become the men and women that God desires for each one of us to be. And in Genesis chapter 45, when the nation of Israel was experiencing a famine in the land, they had to come down to Egypt. And in coming down to Egypt, the brother that they sold to slavery now was going to be the brother that was going to deliver them. And in Genesis 45, verses 4 and 5, in which Joseph, speaking to his brothers who cast him off into the pit, and that could have defined him. But Joseph now says, come closer to me. You cast me off, but now come closer to me. Don't be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve you. So his brothers sold him to destroy him, but God sent him to save his people. Someone once shared with me, the enemy of our souls wants to blind us to truth. The enemy of our souls wants to bind us to sin. The enemy of our souls lies to deceive us. And the enemy of our souls tempts us to defeat us. And so in this pit where Joseph was found before being sold to slavery, that pit could be a pit of pity and discouragement. But God brought Joseph to the palace, and that palace was going to be a place of provision and deliverance. So however we respond to relational disappointment, however we respond to situations that can create revenge and bitterness, may we understand that in those moments that might seem as a disappointment, they can become an appointment that God wants to deliver us. So how do you respond? Do you respond with denial? Do you respond with anger? Do you respond, this relationship will never work? That's bitterness. Or out of that relationship, do you see that resentment can become release, and that bitterness can become better as we release and let God be the God in our lives. So don't allow your past to define, but allow God to use it to refine us to become the people He wants us to be. So when challenges come in our relationships, when disappointment comes in our relationships, may we not subjectively react, but may we see it in an appointment to objectively act and see what God has in store for us. At the end of Genesis, in Genesis chapter 50, in which at the end of his life, Joseph says this, "As for you," speaking to his brothers, "you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result." And so in our relationships, we can see them as an obstacle of challenge, of disappointment, of bitterness. But those relationships can become opportunities of forgiveness. In your relationships of the past, something in our past that occurred, whether it was abuse, whether it was a situation that was not right, whether it was a misunderstanding, and that misunderstanding or that abuse in a relationship can cause as bondage of bitterness. But God wants to take those bondages that we find ourselves, as Joseph was sold into slavery, in which it seemed so unfair, it didn't seem right, in which justice was due, in which when Joseph looked at that, he could have responded that way. He could have responded out of resentment, but he responded out of release. And so in any of your relationships in the past, never allow any one of them to dictate your future. So if you're in a situation right now where you look in your past of a past relationship or a past situation and you can only experience bitterness, today, can it be a situation, a bondage of bitterness that is restricting? That bondage of bitterness that is restricting can become as freedom of forgiveness that is releasing. And in John chapter 8, and Jesus speaking to his disciples, he says, "You shall know the truth, and the truth will set you free." And so in those relationships of our past that have caused us to be caught up in the chains of jealousy, of envy, of resentment, of anger, and whatever it might be, we can try to justify it, and we might wonder why. But as with Joseph, the why became, that's why. A bondage of bitterness that is restricting can become a freedom of forgiveness that is releasing. And so today, as we come to know the truth of Christ, with our eyes fixed on Him, the person, in the midst of whatever problem you're facing, Jesus Christ says, come and know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Let us today love everyone, always, out of forgiveness that God has showed us. May we share that forgiveness to people around us. Let's know the truth, and the truth will set us free.